Citizenship by descent is a great way to get an affordable second passport using your family tree. The second passports you get are generally pretty high quality, and yet there are a number of myths that people fall for that stop them from getting the citizenship to begin with, or that give them unrealistic expectations. I'm going to shatter those myths today. All right, so let's get right into it. Citizenship by descent is the process of using your family tree to claim a second passport from your parents, your grandparents, your great-grandparents, sometimes even further back. Every country has its own standards. Some are more stringent than others, some are faster than others. But I want to cover pretty much 6 main myths that people have when we've helped them. We've gotten more than 24 countries, different citizenships for folks over the years, ranging from Ireland to Italy to Estonia to Portugal to even Latin American countries, and we've even consulted occasionally on some Asian countries where the passports perhaps aren't quite as powerful. And so if it's your first time here, my name is Andrew Henderson. I'm the founder of Nomad Capitalist. We basically help 7- and 8-figure entrepreneurs legally reduce their taxes, diversify and protect their wealth, and increase their freedom around the world. And we help all sorts of people get citizenship by descent. We also host an annual event called Nomad Capitalist Live. Here's myth number 1, is citizenship by descent is easy. I've mentioned before, great quote from a friend of mine, everything is easy and nothing is easy. And so the process of actually applying is easy. Going to the embassy or perhaps going to the country. Every country has a little bit different procedure, but you, generally speaking, don't even need to leave your own country. You can go to a local embassy, a local consulate, or even in some cases just do it through the mail. However, gathering those documents is going to be difficult. And so one thing that people have often overlooked when I'm talking to them is they've had parents that were born in Canada or in Mexico, occasionally in other countries in the Americas. But those are the 2 big ones where if you were born in Canada or Mexico, you are a citizen by birth, right? Doesn't matter what your parents were, doesn't matter where they're from. And so we've had a case where the family was American, but they were down in Mexico when they gave birth. This was the parents. And so the parents had Mexican citizenship, and therefore the child, our client, was entitled to Mexican citizenship. That's a lot easier to prove. Get your parents' birth certificate, get your birth certificate, establish the link, pretty straightforward. Maybe they, in some cases, need to get their citizenship first. It's not always the case, but sometimes a parent needs to get it first, and then you simply come in and claim yours. When you're going back through grandparents, great-grandparents, you may need to go to the archive in another country. That could be in the capital city, or you may actually need to go and get some kind of records from a local village, from a city hall. Again, every country's a little bit different. And so here's my colleague Jelena to talk about that. I'll be right back in a minute.
When it comes to citizenship by descent, you should approach it with caution, as while it may seem easy and straightforward, in some cases it really isn't. First of all, in some cases, even if you have descent and you're eligible by all the rules and standards, if you cannot provide the needed documentation, your application will not be accepted, or you will generally have no way of submitting the application without all the documents. So remember, being eligible doesn't automatically mean you will be able to apply. A second thing to be aware of is that each situation is different, and you should carefully research your descent and gather as much information as possible, down to the date and place of birth of your ancestors, when they got married, and whether dual citizenship was allowed at that time, or whether your family member was in the military, as a case that may seem successful at a first glance may encounter some difficulties. So in some cases, you will have a situation where at a first glance, it seems you're eligible because your grandparents were born in a certain country. However, it doesn't necessarily mean that you will be eligible, as some countries want to see where your parents were born and where you were born, and they don't allow second generation born overseas to obtain citizenship. Such is the case with the UK, Canada, Mexico, and some other countries. However, sometimes even in these situations, you might be an exception if your grandparent was in the military or was a diplomat, which is why it's important to have all the information before coming to a conclusion whether you are eligible or not.
Thanks, Jelena. So the second myth people assume is they can use some kind of DNA test, or they can use, ancestry.com printouts, or anything that you would do on the internet. And so those things can start you in the right direction, but a country's not going to look at a DNA test that you got online and say, oh, you're 37% Lithuanian, step right up. You need to prove, again, what is the family tree through birth certificates, naturalization certificates, baptismal certificates, all sorts of different things. And again, the further back you go, the more documents you need, the higher the chances that something is missing. I've seen cases where you need a document saying, hey, something from the country where they live, let's say the United States, needs to show that they are a certain ethnicity. Well, in the United States, people who become American are American. They don't keep thinking of them as this other ethnicity. And yet, in that country, right, nationality and ethnicity are often used interchangeably. And so sometimes those documents can be hard to get. And so literally there's sometimes when you just can't apply. Hey, it would be easy if you had all the documents, but we've seen cases where it takes years to get those documents. I've had that personal experience, and so that is a challenge. And obviously, you could get all the documents. You could find out, hey, I thought I was entitled to Italian citizenship, but the chain was broken at some point because somebody naturalized and therefore lost the Italian citizenship back when there was no dual citizenship, and therefore now I'm not eligible. We've seen people miss it by a year or two, and they're really upset about it, and they end up going and getting citizenship by investment, for example. But that 1 or 2 years, way back when, ended up costing them a lot of money. The third myth is that you have to learn to speak the language. Hungary sometimes asks for a language test. Poland is not supposed to anymore, but I've seen instances where sometimes they do. Generally speaking, though, if you want to become Italian, if you want to become Irish, okay, they speak English in Ireland, but if you want to become Portuguese, there's generally not a language test required for citizenship by descent. Think of it this way. You would have been entitled to this citizenship had someone not left the country, had they not gone to the United States, had they not fled a war, had they not whatever. And so the idea is, if everything just would have kept going along as planned, you would have just had this citizenship. The way it's described in some places is you basically do have the citizenship. You are one of them. You just need to make it a formality, right? And so if all of your ancestors had this claim, you just go back and knock down the dominoes and, hey, you're Italian. Hey, you're Polish. Hey, you're Latvian. And again, you could go. African countries are starting to open up to this. Latin American countries, we've had folks who've had parents and grandparents from the Caribbean, for example, from South America, and again, even occasionally Asia. So it's not always just in Europe, but you don't generally have to speak the language. Obviously, some countries, the language is English anyway. The fourth myth is that you need to live there before or after. Now, there are some cases, for example, like Italy, where going there and spending a little bit of time can speed up the process. You can go a slightly different route than doing it through the consulate. And so if you want to get it faster and you have that mobility, hey, that could be a way to get the citizenship, in Italy's case, for example, faster. However, you do not need to live there because you're not getting citizenship by naturalization. Sure, any of us can get a residence permit again, let's take Italy as an example. We can move to Italy, and assuming we're not married to an Italian citizen, we can apply for naturalization after 10 years, and then we'll go through the same kind of waiting period that you're going to go through waiting for your citizenship by descent. Different process, but same waiting period where they're processing your citizenship. Some countries are faster, some countries are slower, some take years. And so I can become Italian in a dozen years, for example. If I were to marry an Italian citizen, then I could become an Italian faster. You're not going through that process, and so you don't actually have to live there. Once you get the citizenship, you don't have to live there. However, you can live there. And so this is why, for example, the passport of a European Union country is so valuable. If you are Italian or Portuguese or French or Lithuanian, you could decide to go and live in Ireland or in Bulgaria or anywhere else that you want in the bloc, Switzerland, Sweden. And so you have that optionality. With that comes the ability to take advantage of tax regimes. If you're an EU or EEA citizen, you can go to Switzerland and your tax under the lump sum tax regime is going to be less than someone who's not an EU citizen. And so those passports can come in handy. If you're an Irish, you also have the ability to go to the UK and to settle there. And so you do not have to live there, but you have the ability to live there. Obviously, you also, if you're EU, you get to go through the special EU line when you go, just if you're going on vacation. So I was recently in Milan. Hey, it's a much shorter line for folks who have the EU passport than those who don't. And so you don't have to live there before or after, but you have the optionality. And that's what second passports are all about, is optionality. The fifth myth is people say, well, I don't want an Italian passport, or I don't want this passport, Greek passport, another one that we've helped people with, because I have to pay taxes. If you live in that country and if you become a tax resident of that country, you will have to pay tax. Now, countries like Italy and like Greece, which have tax incentives for people who come and live there, if you have not lived in Italy all but a year for quite a while, you can come and you can take advantage of a number of different tax incentives depending on how much you make, including a program that's similar to but cheaper than Switzerland's lump sum program. And so if you want to live in those countries, in many cases, those tax incentives do not discriminate against their own citizens. There are some programs where if you're a citizen, your chances of getting a tax incentive are going to be more difficult. For example, the UK might be an example in some cases. But if you get Italian or Greek or Portuguese citizenship by descent, you can go and live not only in those countries, but any country in the EU, and you can take advantage of tax incentives, where you pay a flat amount or you pay a greatly reduced rate for 10, 15, whatever years. However, if you don't want to live in that country or in another European country, then you're not going to be taxed. Now, what we've talked about in the past is there may be some countries in the future that roll out citizenship-based taxation, which is what the United States has, where no matter where you live in the world, they will at least force you to file taxes and potentially pay. I've said that some countries may do a lesser version of what the US does, where, hey, you must pay at least 10% somewhere, and if you don't, you can top it up here. If you happen to have an EU passport, I've also surmised potentially that living elsewhere in the EU, that would be more difficult to enforce, and so you could take advantage of a pretty good tax incentive in one EU country, having the citizenship of another, and you could still have a low tax rate. So none of that has happened, right? If you're an Italian and you don't live in Italy, you'll be fine. There's some kind of risk that they could change that in the future, either at the EU level or at individual countries level. So hey, if you're French, keep an eye out for that. But I do think that there could be ways to plan around that, and that's not a current issue. So I wouldn't not get a passport simply because I was worried about some potential future tax risk. You could always deal with it then. I think there'll probably be strategies that would make it a little bit better than outside of the US. The other issue is that you can only live in that country. And so we've already kind of talked about this a little bit, but like, again, if you have any passport of an EU member state, you can live anywhere in the bloc. And so people say, oh, well, I had someone recently, I don't really like Romania. You know, they had a Romanian grandfather. Why do I want Romania? Okay, Romania is not as good as some of the other EU passports. You still can't go to the United States without a visa, but you're in the EU, and so you can live in any of the EU states, and so you have that flexibility. The other thing is, if you're looking for more personal freedom, there's people from Western Europe who are like, I don't want to be Western European. Hey, there are countries that have more personal freedom. Obviously, within the EU, there's certain bloc-wide regulations, but Bulgaria, for example, had more freedom in some instances than some of the Western countries. So you can go west to east or east to west. You have that flexibility. Other examples, we had someone who was actually, their parents were born in St. Kitts and Nevis, and so their parents were citizens of St. Kitts and Nevis, which has a citizenship by investment, but for them, they were able to claim it by descent. They didn't have to make the investment because obviously that's where their family is from. If you are a member, if you're a citizen of an organization of Eastern Caribbean states country, you have 6 countries that you can move between. Not entirely like the EU, but you can think of it in a simplistic way as somewhat similar, where if you're a citizen of St. Kitts and Nevis, you can go and live in St. Lucia. You also have special privileges if you're a citizen of a South American country that's part of Mercosur, and so you can move around there. ASEAN in Southeast Asia, there's certain lesser privileges in terms of visa-free access and things like that. So the EU is probably the big one, and that's where most people are getting citizenship by descent. But we've had folks from Guyana, from St. Kitts and Nevis, from Barbados who had family from there. Those passports are pretty helpful as well. CARICOM, by the way, not as tight-knit as the Eastern Caribbean states, but CARICOM in the Caribbean could also be something. You can make an investment for citizenship by investment and get those passports and have that same level of access, but if you have the ancestry, you can do it for free. And so don't think that because you got a passport in one country, you can only live in that country. Now, if you are one of the aforementioned folks who has a Canadian parent or a Mexican parent, sure, Mexican citizenship is basically good for living in Mexico. And so don't look at these passports just as where they can get you visa-free. We've helped people, for example, get Armenian citizenship by descent if you have Armenian ancestry or if you've been baptized as Armenian. We've helped people get Israeli citizenship. And so Israel is a pretty good passport. Armenia is not as good for travel. But I can tell you what Armenia lacks in travel, it makes up for in a pretty responsive government that helps you with other aspects of your global plan. So don't look at just the visa-free travel. Don't look at just where you can live. Don't be held back by some of these myths about citizenship by investment. By and large, with a few exceptions like Iran or Syria or something like that, if I'm entitled to citizenship through my family tree, I'm going to claim that. I'm going to put that passport in my back pocket, if not actually move to that country or somewhere else that I can move with it. I'm going to build my options using these affordable citizenship programs.